quickly. Settle down.
The war in Bosnia and Herzegovina came about as a result of the breakup of Yugoslavia. In 1989, Slobodan Milosevic became president of Serbia. Crisis emerged in Yugoslavia with the weakening of the communist system at the end of the Cold War. This was particularly noticeable in Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to a lesser extent in Slovenia and Republic of Macedonia. NATO air forces first became involved in the former Yugoslavia in the summer 1992, when the alliance decided to dispatch naval units to the Adriatic Sea. Their task was to enforce the United Nations arms embargo against the now independent republics. At the same time, individual NATO countries made available tactical transport aircraft to fly humanitarian aid into the besieged capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Sarajevo airlift was run by the UN High Commissioner and continued until January 1996, flying some 12,951 sorties into the city with the loss of one Italian aircraft to an anti-aircraft missile. More than 50 aircraft were hit by ground fire while making the dangerous approach to the city's single runway airport. In February 1993, the humanitarian airlift was expanded by the United States, France, and Germany to include airdrops of aid to besieged Bosnian enclaves. This operation involved some 2,828 sorties up to August 1994. The continuing escalation of the Bosnian conflict in the autumn of 1992 forced the international organization to increase the crisis management efforts to contain the war. In October 1992, the UN imposed a no-fly zone for military aircraft over Bosnia. Bosnia's warring factions showed total disregard for the NFZ, and amid the Srebrenica crisis in March 1993, it was agreed by the international community that NATO air power would be used to enforce the flight ban. On April 12, 1993, NATO aircraft began Operation Deny Flight, which saw around-the-clock fighter combat air patrols over Bosnia to stop the warring factions from using combat aircraft. In October and November 1994, the Muslim Croat Federation launched a large offensive around the town of Bihać in far northwestern Bosnia. The Serbs soon launched a counterattack, and in support of their operations launched airstrikes with aircraft based at Udbina in the Serb-controlled area of Croatia. The Serb aircraft dropped napalm and cluster bombs. Although most of the ordnance came from old, unreliable stocks and many failed to explode, the attacks were a clear violation of the no-fly zone and a challenge to NATO. NATO immediately looked for ways to respond, but its forces were not permitted to carry out operations in Croatian airspace. Due to Bihac's proximity to the border, Serb aircraft could attack into Bosnia, then cross back into Croatia before being intercepted. As such, NATO was powerless to stop the incursions. In recognition of the situation, the Security Council passed Resolution 958, which allowed NATO aircraft to operate in Croatia. On November 21st, NATO acted under its new authority with a strike on the Udbina airfield. The strike, which involved 39 aircraft, was the largest combat operation in NATO's history up to that time. Nonetheless, it was criticized as a pinprick that did little real damage to Serb capabilities, only temporarily disabling runways. The NATO forces deliberately refrained from attacking Serbian planes at the airfield and only targeted runways and anti-aircraft capabilities. Following the Udbina strike, NATO continued to launch strikes in the area. And on November 23rd, after a NATO reconnaissance plane was illuminated by the radar of a surface-to-air missile, SAM, system, NATO planes attacked SAM sites at Otoka and Dvor with AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles. After the strikes at Otoka and Dvor, the Bosnian Serbs continued to target NATO aircraft with surface-to-air missiles while advancing against the Bihać enclave. On November 24th, Serb forces fired radar-guided missiles at 2 British F-3 Tornado aircraft. The next day, the Serbs fired on 2 NATO F-16s. In responses to this growing SAM threat, NATO suspended flights in Bosnian airspace on December 2nd. Shortly after the suspension of NATO flights, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter personally negotiated a 4-month ceasefire in Bosnia. Although there were some violations of this ceasefire, most of the parties in the conflict heeded it. Although 1994 ended peacefully with the Carter ceasefire, NATO continued planning for new operations. Both NATO and UN officials believed that after the ceasefire expired in March, the fighting would resume. They were right. As the fighting gradually widened, Bosnian forces launched a large-scale offensive in the area of Sarajevo. In response to these actions, the UN commander, Lieutenant General Rupert Smith, requested NATO airstrikes. NATO honored the request on May 25 and May 26, 1995, by bombing a Serb ammunition dump at Pele. On June 2, 1995, Captain Scott O'Grady of the United States Air Force was sent on a routine no-fly zone patrol in his F-16. While on patrol, O'Grady's F-16 was shot down by a Serb SA-6 surface-to-air missile system. O'Grady ejected safely but was trapped in Serb territory. According to many U.S. officials, he may have been deliberately targeted so that the Serbs could take an American hostage. After O'Grady was shot down, tensions increased greatly between NATO and the Bosnian Serbs. A number of U.S. commanders called for immediate retaliatory airstrikes. However, the Serbs still held a number of hostages seized after the bombing of Pele. The threat to the hostages prevented NATO from acting more forcefully. Nonetheless, the situation remained explosive for the next 6 days until O'Grady was rescued on June 8th, ending the calls for immediate offensive action. By late December, the planners developed a plan called Deadeye, designed to eliminate Serb SAM capabilities so that NATO could regain uncontested air superiority. Over the next several months, the planning for Deadeye gradually evolved into the plan for Operation Deliberate Force, a massive bombing of Serb targets that was eventually executed in August and September 1995. In the course of the operation, NATO aircraft destroyed key Bosnian Serb air defense sites, command posts, communications towers, ammunition depots, bridges, surface-to-air missile batteries, and artillery batteries. Some 708 precision-guided weapons and 300 iron bombs were used during the air offensive, along with 13 Tomahawk cruise missiles fired by a U.S. Navy cruiser in the Adriatic. Under the weight of this highly accurate bombardment, which was eating away at the prized military assets, the Bosnian Serbs gave in to the UN demands. Barely a month later, Serb, Croat, and Bosnian political leaders signed the Dayton Peace Accords, ending the war. Following the 1998 terrorist bombings of the U.S. embassies in East Africa, Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, said, "I think it is important for the American people to understand that we are in a long-term struggle. This war against terrorism is, unfortunately, the war of the future." The American military response to the embassy bombings was described at the time as the most formidable American military assault ever against a private sponsor of terrorism. One of the principal reasons the United States and the world found itself in such a war is Osama bin Laden and his terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda. By 1998, bin Laden was able to amass a following of roughly 3,000 followers. Even more important, these followers were already geographically dispersed when they returned home to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, following their combat experiences in Afghanistan. Senior figures in the network are also senior leaders in other Islamic terrorist networks. Before the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in Africa, Al-Qaeda had already committed significant acts of violence. One of bin Laden's first attempted strikes at the United States occurred in December 1992, when his terrorists attempted to bomb a hotel in Yemen, where 100 American peacekeepers were billeted before entering Somalia. The attack failed to kill American soldiers, but did kill 2 Australian tourists. Next, Al-Qaeda was linked to the February 1993 World Trade Center truck bombing. In October 1993, Al-Qaeda was involved in the killing of 18 American servicemen in Mogadishu, Somalia. In 1995, Al-Qaeda detonated a car bomb in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, killing 5 Americans and 2 Indians. That same year also saw Al-Qaeda aid in the assassination attempt on Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. In June 1996, Al-Qaeda was implicated in the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia that killed 19 U.S. service members and injured 264 others. In early 1998, bin Laden and the Islamic extremists in East Africa committed themselves to a string of operations designed to show the world their commitment to jihad and their wide span of operations. Bin Laden's alliance warned the world that they would soon deliver a message to Americans, which we hope they read with care, because we will write it, with God's help, in a language they will understand. To these ends, terrorism cells were placed in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. 1,000 pounds of explosives were delivered to safe houses in each of the African capitals, where these cells assembled the explosives into bombs. With guidance to conduct the bombings of the U.S. embassies, the terrorist groups approached the buildings in their bomb-laden vehicles on the morning of August 7, 1998. In Nairobi, an unarmed embassy guard had a brush with the terrorists as they tried to unsuccessfully enter the embassy compound. As he fled for his life, the terrorists detonated their bomb. The ensuing blast killed 247 people and wounded another 5,000. Among the dead were 12 Americans. At about the same time, the bomb in Tanzania was detonated and exploded outside the embassy gate. While killing no Americans, this blast killed 11 Africans and injured 72. Islamic extremists soon touted their achievements. Before the embassy bombings, the Clinton administration had a nonviolent, four-pronged approach to dealing with terrorism. First, the United States would make no concessions with terrorists. Second, the United States would seek to bring justice to those who were involved in terrorism. Third, the government would isolate and change the behavior of terrorists. Fourth, the United States would work with other nations to create a global anti-terrorism environment. Following the embassy bombings, it appeared that this policy, divorced from the use of military force, was inadequate. Madeleine Albright said, "I've just returned from both sites, and they are chilling. The tragic human face of indiscriminate terrorist murder. We cannot allow such cowardly and destructive acts to go unpunished. Inaction would be an invitation to further horror. President Clinton had previously been given wide latitude by Congress to deal with terrorism. Following the Oklahoma City bombings, Congress empowered him to use all necessary means, including covert action and military force, to disrupt, dismantle, and destroy international infrastructure used by international terrorists, including overseas terrorist training facilities and safe havens. Armed with the ability to act, the president needed proof to act militarily against the perpetrator. He told his key advisers on August 12th that he didn't need proof that would hold up in a court of law. However, the proof still had to be conclusive. Evidence that bin Laden was involved in the embassy bombings quickly surfaced. Roughly 5 days later, an intercepted cell phone call linked two of bin Laden's associates to the attacks. Intelligence indicated that further attacks were pending. The U.S. intelligence community began to receive a substantial volume of credible and reliable information that there were other attacks planned against U.S. targets around the world. Another concern for the administration was the potential for al-Qaeda to acquire and use weapons of mass destruction. Reports indicated that they were actively seeking to acquire weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons for use against U.S. citizens and U.S. interests around the world. These attacks on the embassies made this a sobering possibility. President Clinton had the evidence he required and the knowledge of possible future attacks. With the proof he needed in hand, President Bill Clinton decided to strike back on August 14th. Clinton said, "From the moment we learned of the bombings, our mission was clear: identify those responsible, bring them to justice, protect our citizens from future attacks." Following the August 7th bombings, President Clinton ordered preliminary planning for a military response. At the next meeting with his planners on August 12th, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Hugh Shelton ran through the list of options. He told the president that he had considered attacks by ground forces and conventional aircraft, but had ruled both out due to the risk they placed upon the American combatants. For the same reasons, the president agreed. Both agreed that cruise missiles could strike the enemy while minimizing U.S. risk. Two target areas were selected. First, in Afghanistan, was the Coast terrorist training camp, located roughly 100 miles south of Kabul. The bin Laden network was intimately connected with the Coast training facilities. Sometimes referred to as Terrorist University, this is the largest Sunni terrorist training facility in the world. At these facilities, terrorists from around the world receive paramilitary training that ranges from target practice to improvising explosive devices to training on tanks and other armored vehicles. In recent months, there had been an expansion of these facilities, including construction of new buildings, which indicated that an increase in training activity was planned. These facts helped shape the decision to strike at these facilities. According to General Shelton, about 600 personnel normally inhabited the camp. Secretary Cohen and General Shelton believed that convincing evidence existed to indicate that the embassy bombers trained at this facility. Another reason provided justification to strike the Coast camp. Intelligence indicated that a gathering of key terrorist leaders or a terrorist convention was to have occurred on the day of the attack. The other target selected was the El Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Sudan that President Clinton announced was involved in the production of materials for chemical weapons. According to the New York Times, administration and intelligence officials believed that senior Iraqi scientists were helping to produce elements of the nerve agent VX at the factory. President Clinton gave the approval for the U.S. Navy mission planners to begin preparing for the attacks. Part of the preparation involved the complex process of mapping out the route of each missile to ensure that it would not conflict with another missile while in flight. Operation Infinite Reach called for approximately 70 Tomahawk missiles to strike the Coast terrorist camp, while approximately 6 missiles were to strike the El Shifa plant. According to Secretary Cohen, our plan was to attack these sites with sufficient power to certainly disrupt them and hopefully destroy them. Several of the Tomahawks targeted at the camps carried cluster munitions designed to disperse shrapnel-like bomblets over a large area. Cluster munitions are especially effective against personnel. In this operation, collateral damage was just not an issue. The attack on the El Shifa plant required special attention, since it was thought to contain highly dangerous materials. The attacks were conducted at night to minimize civilian casualties. 4 surface vessels and 1 submarine located in the Arabian Sea launched their missiles through Pakistani airspace into the coast facility in Afghanistan. 2 surface vessels fired their missiles from the Red Sea into Sudan. The Tomahawk missiles struck at exactly 1300 hours Eastern Time. The President and his administration put forth 3 primary objectives for infinite reach. The first was to damage al-Qaeda's ability to execute terrorist attacks by hitting the infrastructure at the coast facility and presumably kill as many terrorists as possible. The cruise missiles that landed in Afghanistan heavily damaged or destroyed virtually every soft target at the sprawling mountain training camp, including barracks, communications equipment, and arms stockpiles. The ruling Taliban government in Afghanistan claimed that 21 people had been killed at the coast facility, but these numbers were unsubstantiated. Unfortunately, no top terrorist leaders were killed, and there is no corroborating evidence of a terrorist summit at the camp. Infinite Reach's second objective was to deny al-Qaeda chemical weapons from the El Shifa plant. The plant was hit with remarkable precision. The factory's walls fell inward, while not 10 feet outside them, 55-gallon drums remained standing. The roof came down, the assembly line was blown apart, and yet the candy factory that shared a wall with the plant was left intact. The factory was obliterated by the strike, which one U.S. official said was designed to make the building fall in on itself, limiting the chance of toxins escaping into the air. Civilian casualties were reported to be 10 wounded, with 1 possible fatality. Quite a bit of controversy has occurred regarding the production of key elements for chemical weapons by this facility. The dispute continues. However, once identified as a target, regardless of its purpose, it was summarily destroyed. The final objective was to deter further planned attacks. According to Secretary Albright, it is very likely something would have happened had we not done this. According to American officials, before the raids, attacks were imminent on U.S. embassies in Albania and Pakistan. These embassies were not hit, and from a limited perspective, this final objective appears to have been met. One lesson that is highlighted by Operation Infinite Reach is the versatility that cruise missiles give political leaders and military planners when high-threat targets are attacked. Cruise missiles were first introduced to combat during the initial phase of Operation Desert Storm. From the senior leader's perspective, cruise missiles are enticing because they offer a response without risking American lives. From a planner's perspective, cruise missiles offer several benefits to manned aircraft. Fired from the ocean surface or stateside-based aircraft, cruise missiles do not require staging rights from foreign governments. The raid in Sudan showed that cruise missiles could be used to strike difficult targets while minimizing civilian casualties. 2 prerequisites make this possible. First, cruise missiles are highly accurate. The missiles used in Infinite Reach were Block 3 Tomahawks that have an accuracy of 30 feet due to Global Positioning System guidance. The second requirement limiting civilian casualties is solid intelligence. Knowing the area's civilian patterns is crucial. One of the negative aspects of using cruise missiles is their cost. Essentially, every time the United States fires a cruise missile, it is firing a $750,000 asset on a one-way trip. The Infinite Reach raid ate up more than $500 million in ordnance, most of it fired at a batch of backwoods barracks. The war on terrorism did not end with Infinite Reach, and Infinite Reach failed to deliver a decisive blow to Al-Qaeda. At the time of the retaliatory strikes, a former CIA counterterrorism expert stated that Infinite Reach did very little to hurt bin Laden and probably initiated a new round of violence. The message that President Clinton sought to send was, "Let our actions today send this message loud and clear. There are no expendable American targets. There will be no sanctuary for terrorists." However, the message bin Laden received was, "The American bombardment had only shown that the world is governed by the law of the jungle. That brutal, treacherous attack killed a number of civilian Muslims. As for material damage, it was minimal. By the grace of God, the missiles were ineffective." The raid proved that the American Army is going downhill in its morale. Its members are too cowardly and too fearful to meet the young people of Islam face to face. By the late 1990s, conditions in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia had improved. However, conditions worsened in Kosovo, a part of Yugoslavia still subject to the rule of President Milosevic's regime. While implementation of the Dayton Accord terms provided a measure of security and stability to Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia, Milosevic tightened his authority over Kosovo. Human rights violations began to occur, triggering resistance from the Kosovar Albanians living there. At first, nonviolent activities characterized this resistance, but the inability of such measures to influence Serbian policy led to the creation of the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, an armed paramilitary organization. In 1998, Milosevic responded with a steady increase of Serbian forces in Kosovo. The escalation of violence led to a proposed settlement of the unrest, brokered by the U.S. and its European allies. The Kosovars agreed, but Milosevic rejected the settlement. Instead, Serbian forces undertook the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo. They sought to eliminate the presence of Kosovar Albanians from the region, using a variety of tactics that included executions. A mass exodus ensued, in which nearly 1 million Kosovars fled to neighboring countries, where they flooded refugee camps. NATO responded with Operation Allied Force in March 1999, an air campaign intended to force Serbian compliance with the terms offered at Rambouillet. Operation Allied Force was a large-scale air campaign to destroy Yugoslav military infrastructure from high altitudes. Ground units were not initially used because NATO wanted to minimize the risk of losing forces, as well as avoiding public criticism related to its relative ineffectiveness against mobile ground targets. NATO's bombing campaign involved 1,000 aircraft operating from air bases in Italy and Germany, and the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt stationed in the Adriatic Sea. At dusk, FA-18s of the Spanish Air Force were the first NATO planes to bomb Belgrade and perform SEAD operations. BGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired from ships and submarines. The U.S. was the dominant member of the coalition against Yugoslavia, although all NATO members were involved. These included the French Navy and Air Force flying the Superintendard and the Mirage 2000. The Italian Air Force operated with 34 Tornado, 12 F-104, 12 AMX, 2 B-707, and the Italian Navy operated with Harrier II. The British Royal Air Force operated the Harrier GR-7 and Tornado ground attack jets, as well as an array of support aircraft. Belgian, Danish, Dutch, and Turkish air forces operated F-16s. The Spanish Air Force deployed the F-18s and KC-130s. The Canadian Air Force deployed a total of 18 CF-18s, enabling them to be responsible for 10% of all bombs dropped in the operation. The fighters were armed with both guided and unguided dumb munitions, including the Paveway series of laser-guided bombs. For the German Luftwaffe, this mission was its first conflict participation since World War II. During the 10 weeks of the conflict, NATO aircraft flew over 38,000 combat missions. In addition to fixed-wing aircraft, 1 battalion of Apache helicopters was deployed to help combat missions. The regiment was augmented by pilots from Fort Bragg's 82nd Airborne Attack Helicopter Battalion. The battalion secured AH-64 Apache attack helicopter refueling sites and a small team forward deployed to the Albania-Kosovo border to identify targets for NATO airstrikes. After the third day, also known by NATO officials as Day 3, almost all of the strategic military targets of Yugoslavia were destroyed. But the Yugoslav army still managed to keep standing and still attack KLA insurgents who were still stationed inside Kosovo, mostly the regions of northern and southwest Kosovo. Strategic economic and society targets such as bridges, military facilities, official government facilities, and factories were bombed. Long-range cruise missiles were used to hit heavily defended targets such as strategic installations in Belgrade and Pristina, infrastructure such as power plants using the BLU-114B soft bomb. Water processing plants and the state-owned broadcaster were also targeted, creating many more environmental and economic problems all throughout Serbia and Kosovo. An important portion of the war involved combat between the Yugoslav Air Force and the opposing air forces. United States Air Force F-15s and F-16s, flying mainly from Italian Air Force bases, attacked the defending Yugoslav fighters, mainly MiG-29s, which were in bad shape due to lack of spare parts and maintenance. The U.S. Army also deployed Task Force Hawk to Albania to support the air campaign. Composed of units drawn from the 1st Armored Division, this force included artillery and attack helicopters intended for possible use against Serbian targets inside Kosovo.
We were slated to go to Kuwait for a 4-month rotation, and we found out on a Friday that we're not going to Kuwait. And on Sunday, we were sitting on a tarmac in Germany waiting to go into Kosovo. At the time, they said, well, it's going to be an invasion. The next day, they said it was going to be a peaceful entry. Then they said it was going to be an invasion. So it was somewhat tense. And we based out of Macedonia, the very camp I was at the year prior. And so I was somewhat familiar. And watching the news, watching the Germans go in and immediately getting in firefights, we knew it was different. We knew that this was going to be a very different atmosphere than Bosnia, and a very different atmosphere, certainly than Macedonia mission.
Task Force Hawk also included mechanized infantry, 2 scout platoons, and Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion, 35th Armor Regiment. These units provided ground security for the task force.
I was a young sergeant then, and I was in a senior scout role as a sergeant, and I had a great deal of responsibility. And I was find myself in the past missions I was concerned about myself as a soldier, and this time I had to be concerned about myself secondary. I had to be concerned about my younger soldiers, my 18, 19-year-old troops, and that kept me focused. Was thinking about them and thinking about their fears, and trying to remind them and go over the training we had and to allay the fears that they had, and it kept me really focused on negating my fears.
Task Force Hawk began to deploy to Albania in April 1999. Its tank company was airlifted, the first time Abrams tanks had been operationally deployed in this manner. By June, the NATO air campaign had finally convinced Milosevic of the necessity to withdraw Yugoslavian troops from Kosovo and cease ethnic cleansing. As the columns of Serbian troops withdrew, NATO ground forces entered Kosovo to ensure stability. They were led into the province by Charlie Company's tanks.
We were escorting a British intelligence officer into Pristina to facilitate a link-up with his counterparts, and we encountered a column of Serb tanks, and the first part of the column they waved and took pictures and smiled. They were happy to leave alive, and we were just happy that they were leaving. And we were stuck at an intersection with them in a bombed out part of the city, and I remember reading the map, and my gunner, I remember him saying, oh God, no. And I looked up, and the armored column, every vehicle one by one was pointing their tank barrel at my Humvee. And we were sitting probably 50 meters from them, and we were watching them exit. A lot of news media was around. And according to our rules of engagement, that was all it really took for us to engage them. And I was sitting there thinking with my machine gun and my 4-column Humvee that I could do some damage, but we would be nothing but a smoldering target reference point. So I made the decision. I called the lieutenant and said, hey, we need to back down. And we informed some British tanks that were down the hill, and they came up and changed the minds quickly of the Serbs. And the Serbs decided that wasn't going to be their day to fight.
The mission of NATO forces in Kosovo lay in the temporary assumption of civil administration and peacekeeping duties while monitoring the Serbian withdrawal. Participating troops constituted the Kosovo Force, or KFOR. They worked to provide a safe environment for returning refugees by removing mines, booby traps, and demolition preparations left by the retreating Serbian soldiers.
What really affected me was being on the border and seeing the first day the refugees were allowed back in. Thousands, I don't know, 100,000 refugees walking. We lost count, and we managed the border area and let them through. And every one of them had no identification, no vehicle, on foot. And the Serbs systematically had removed their identification, every level of identification from them. And I remember seeing wagons full of women, old women and kids. And we were stopping vehicles to look for weapons and making it back into the country. And I recall picking up a tarp on one of the vehicles and seeing there's a grandmother there that held up a child that was my daughter's age. It was probably 11 months old. And it really affected me because she was wearing just one item of clothing. They had no water, no food, and we had found a safe there and broke it open. It was full of local money. So we just handed out handfuls of money and water to them because they had nothing, literally nothing. And it really affected me because I realized at that point the systematic level of what the Serbs had tried to do there. They had really tried to eradicate and wipe off just the identity of the Albanians. And seeing the mayors of towns in the wells shot in the head, that affected me some. Seeing the graves of children in shallow graves where the Serbs had killed them, executed them in front of their families. That was a little, it brought it much more to the forefront because the bodies were still there and the smells were much worse. And seeing a herd of cattle that had walked into a minefield and the smell, it was 90 degrees. And so in Bosnia, it was much more sterile. You heard the stories of what happened, but in Kosovo, you saw what happened. And then I also saw there were some Serb Catholics that stayed around, the villagers. And then I saw the retribution enacted by the local Albanians. They would burn their churches down and you would find pigs running loose in a village, and you knew what that was. The Albanians had gone in and killed the Serb farmer and let his pigs go because the Albanians didn't keep pigs, they were Muslim. So there was a lot of retribution, and it was much more violent in Kosovo.
In 2001, Milosevic was arrested and transferred to the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague to stand trial for crimes against humanity. In Kosovo, NATO forces remain to help administer and rebuild the province. The U.S. military presence also remained on a rotational basis and included armor.